The marketplace of ideas is so over by the end of this year. Unless, of course, we get 334 new podcast subscribers this week, which will keep us on track to 10,000 podcast subscribers by the end of 2011. Then we can keep on doing the in-depth cultural conversation into 2012 and beyond. For more details, subscribe to the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. Go to colinmarshallradio.com to find the details and find out how you can help the show continue on. Thanks. In this book, we have a character who, in the early part of his life, lives in an isolated kind of a way, except he goes into an office and makes up the lives of various fake bloggers. In the second part of his life, he's still isolated, but he seems to be trying to register the world around him in his mind as well as possible. Would it be at all correct for me to say that in both parts of his life, or in both of his lives, he is a kind of novelist?
It's a comparison that a number of people have made and have mentioned in reviews or asked me about. It's not something I thought about very deliberately while writing it or had in mind. I was thinking in terms of creativity more generally, what it takes to be creative, what it means to be creative, the kind of space that creativity can happen from. The more direct comparison to him as a writer, although having had it raised to me, seems kind of it's all over the story now. The fact that he blogged, the fact that he, imagined someone recording his life. Text and the writing of text seems to be very important to him, so presumably was important to me in writing it, but it kind of snuck up on me after the fact in a way, which has given me something to think about now.
From KCSB in Santa Barbara and Colin Marshall Radio, I'm Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm speaking with Steve Himmer, who teaches at Emerson College, who edits the webjournal Necessary Fiction, and who has written his first novel, just published by Atticus Books, The Bee-Loud Glade. And this main character that we're discussing, Finch, I mentioned, and this will intrigue audiences, I think, in a sense, intrigue them maybe in kind of a dark way, that he starts out employed as a blogger building a brand identity at a company that makes fake plants, and there's a lot of perhaps wish fulfillment for audiences who are reading a book like this and who have a job maybe equally bad and find that this guy finds a way out, which we'll talk about, or stumbles upon a way out. But first, a relevant question here seems to be, and this isn't in the text, so I don't know if we can address Finch's specific circumstance, but how does someone get into a job like that in their 40s, let alone get out of it into the whole scenario Finch finds?
Well, I think getting into it is probably easier than getting out of it. I think it's in some ways reflective of a kind of cultural moment where nobody quite knows what works as marketing or what is reaching people. There's a lot of skepticism about whether advertising in the traditional sense is still working. And I think as far as the blogging goes, there was, I don't know how much this happens now, but a few years ago when blogs were still relatively new, there were a number of companies trying out these kinds of approaches to, fake blogs or pseudo real blogs even as a way of selling products. And there's actually a couple of somewhat specific references in the story. There's a joke about flavored milk drinks on blogs. And that was actually a real, I don't remember the name of the product now, Happy Cow or Laughing Cow or something. But they had hired real teenagers to blog about their lives, but work in mentions of this milk product, this flavored milk drink a few years ago. And there was a couple who worked for Walmart, traveling around the country in their RV, camping in different Walmart parking lots, and then writing about the experience on their blog. So genuine experiences, but also with the purpose behind it of marketing through the blogs. So the idea of someone using blogs much more deliberately, the way Finch does, to actually make up lives, insert those lives into other discussions that aren't even necessarily about artificial plants as a way of selling those plants, didn't seem so terribly far-fetched. And I could imagine pretty easily someone who had started his career in marketing in some of the more traditional ways, newspapers, magazines, reaching out to those traditional venues, kind of stumbling into or just being around long enough that he ends up having to make sense of the world of blogs and the web and all of the new tools that have come around. I guess that answers the how does he get there question. The how does he get away from it? I guess pretty much he just gets fired, so it's kind of out of his control, and then has this set of very particular, somewhat useless skills, perhaps, that he has to find something else to do with, and is just lucky enough that the opportunity is delivered to him by that same medium, by the kind of anonymity of the web. An email arrives that from nowhere that offers him this new life.
Now, do you see Finch, the actual character in this book, as sort of what you just described, as a career marketer who finds himself lost in, to use an awful term, the new media landscape?
I see him as a career marketer, but not necessarily intentionally so. I don't think he's someone who set out to be in that role or set out to be in any role in particular. It's just the career that he happened to end up in, and I suppose he could have ended up in any other career, because he's not a guy who seems especially goal-driven, at least in the beginning of the story or the earlier part of his life. He doesn't strike me as a guy who had a particular career path in mind or a particular intention, and he's just ended up in one place rather than any number of others. So I think he's less deliberate than that.
Now, a week or two before this broadcast, the listener will have heard an interview on this program with Lee Rourke, author of The Canal, a book where its nameless protagonist gets so fed up with his equally insubstantial seeming 21st century job that he just goes to a bench all day and sits there, morning, noon, night, just sits on a bench, just looks around him, just tries to be aware. And Finch he's not quite so active. As you said, he gets fired. Presumably his boss or sub-boss or what have you realizes he's not doing a lot. And he does sit, but he sits at home getting filthier and filthier, never bathing, watching nature videos on the web. This is the first instance and the first moment in the book when I realized that Finch is not an everyman. There's something about him that is maybe different, but I don't know how to put my finger on it. What about Finch leads him to just quit bathing? I feel like maybe I'd stay home, but I don't know that I would stop maintaining myself.
I think he is, to some extent, driven in that section of the story and other parts of the story as well, driven by an interest in consequences and having never thought about them before. And he actually, in that section of the story where he's staying at home, he's not opening the door, he's not even looking outside, he allows himself to become just rancid and filthy, and he stops paying his bills, and he actually wonders about, what actually happens if I stop paying my bills? Do people really kick down the door and throw me out? Is that, the stories that he's heard all his life about the consequences of being a deadbeat and so forth, he's wondering about, and he's not doing anything actively to oppose them. He's not rebelling. He's not standing up for himself. He's just very passively and literally sitting still, wondering what will happen if he sees these things through to their end, these actions or inactions that he's heard have consequences all his life, but he's never actually seen the consequences. So he's wondering about that. And they end up having consequences, not necessarily in the ways he anticipates.
It seems like when you put it that way, it's almost like an inevitability. Like we all kind of get curious about seeing what happens if we let the balls we're juggling drop, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, and I think we often stop ourselves from finding out, or we are stopped from finding out, or it just seems stupid to find out. And I think you mentioned The Canal, Lee Rourke's book, which I'm a big fan of, actually. And I think one difference maybe is in that story, there's a violence, and without giving too much away to folks who haven't read it, but there's a kind of violence to where that story heads, and a kind of simmering tension around that violence, and the consequences that happen to characters in that story tend to have that darker tinge. Finch's is much more passive. It's much quieter in the sense of, the consequences that befall him are not dramatic ones. They're not violent ones, really. They're just kind of where inaction leads, and it tends to be more inaction most of the time, I think.
And those two books, yours and Lee's, they both, as I mentioned, start, or they don't quite start, but they early on have their protagonist leave their job in some way, and the job is pretty awful. So it taps into perhaps a reader's feeling that, hey, I'd kind of like to do that too. I mean, do you see a bottomless well of I don't know what to put it, but a sort of a bottomless well of connection. Like there's so much of that sentiment out there on the part of readers that it's kind of worthwhile to tap into it.
I think, yeah, on the one hand, perhaps there's a calculated way it can be tapped into that everybody works, whether they like it or not. And there's an awful lot to think about there. I think it's a really rich ground for writing. And I'm trying to remember who it was. There's a long article, I think, in the New York Times, Alain de Botton, who had written about kind of why aren't people writing about work? Why isn't The Office being written about? And I actually think there's a lot of interesting fiction and writing coming out of work because it's something that defines people's lives and identities so significantly. And it's certainly the case for Finch that he's single, he's childless, he's friendless for the most part, is defined by his job. At the same time, he doesn't care about that job one way or the other. So it doesn't define him in any meaningful way. It just defines him in a very practical way. And I don't know that that's new. I mean, I think Bartleby the Scrivener, the Melville story, was very much in my mind as I wrote this novel and then in thinking about it after the fact. I think it's a very prescient story that Melville wrote about that kind of identity, the office identity, the worker identity, in a job that is kind of disembodied and disconnected from who you might be in a much more physical way. And I think that as more and more of our labor becomes disembodied in the sense of the work is happening on the computer or on the phone or wherever it is, and yet the body's sitting there in the chair somewhere, there's a lot of tension between that simultaneous embodiment and disembodiment that can be explored and thought about, and some real fun can be had with it.
And you mentioned Alain de Botton. He's been on this program to discuss, in fact, his book about work. And a lot of what I got from that book and from what we talked about is that work, as we commonly see it, jobs, they're both not thought directly about enough, perhaps. And a lot of the jobs that we have these days don't necessarily hold up to direct scrutiny. Do you know what I mean by that?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I do, but I mean, is that a sentiment you have?
Yeah, I think some of that may be related to the fact that the people who are writing fiction, writers, emerging writers, folks who are trying to write and be published, are often working in jobs they aren't particularly attached to, the kind of quintessential day job that the artist has. So it's not a part of yourself that you want to acknowledge as much or want to pay as much attention to in favor of writing about the parts of your life or the imagined parts of your life that are much more exciting to you, so that the job gets short shrift there. And unless someone like Wallace Stevens, who was fulfilled both in his work and in his poetry, maybe it's a different relationship. But I think that's a big part of it, that it's unacknowledged in the sense that we don't even want to acknowledge it. And there's certainly jobs that I've had I wouldn't want to write about, I wouldn't necessarily want to think about much again, because they felt very tangential to who I saw myself as at that point in my life. Even if I spent 8, 9, 10 hours a day at that job and it was the biggest thing going on in most of my days, it wasn't how I wanted to define myself. And it's an interesting struggle there, that it does define you whether you want it to or not, because it's what you're committing the most of yourself to.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but Finch, when he is employed as a blogger or whatever he's doing, he doesn't seem to wrestle with the issue of self-definition much, does he?
No, he doesn't seem particularly concerned about much of anything. I think he's just drifting in a very kind of connectionless way. He shows up at work every day. He sits at his desk. At some point in the years he's worked there, he stopped really doing much work and is just playing around online, writing these blogs, making up lives for his characters and imagining what they might be doing. But I don't think he's concerned much one way or the other about how all of that defines him until he's faced with a shift, and outside his own control, he's got to find some new way to spend his time, essentially. I think much more than finding a new means of self-definition, he needs to find a way to spend his time, because he has all of this empty time spread out before him and nothing much to fill it with.
And when he's in his period of having no job, being in his apartment and getting filthier and filthier, going around on the internet watching nature videos and whatnot, you have a device in the book that you make work, but it seems to me like a device, and I've never taken a writing class, but it seems to me a device that any writing teacher would scream at you not to do, which is a millionaire or perhaps a billionaire stepping in and changing the character's circumstances for him. Now, am I correct in assuming that that's usually a no-no unless you really know what you're doing to make that work, like you evidently do?
I would think so. I would think that would be frowned upon. It's very contrived to have that sort of device. On the other hand, there's some great stories that have come out of that sort of intervention. Deus Ex Millionaire, maybe, I don't know. But, anything, comedy from Brewster's Millions, the film. But also the other thing that I think let me off the hook a little bit, or that made me feel like I could use that device as much as it is a device, is that it's historically accurate to some degree, that this career that Finch embarks on as a decorative hermit was an actual job. There were actual wealthy landowners who did hire some, jobless person to be their hermit and live on their estate. So just even if I'm making it contemporary, playing with the facts of how it usually happened, there is some historical basis to that in my head at least allowed me to play with that contrivance.
Now, where in history are we talking about? What sort of millionaires were doing this? Were hiring hermits?
The Georgian period, if I'm recalling correctly from the reading I did, but it was in the period when French landscape architecture and garden design was going in the direction of order, and English landscape design and gardens were going in the direction of contrived chaos or overgrowth. So ruins were being built on estates, not actual ruins, but ruins constructed to look like ruins. Gardens were being allowed to grow in a way that looked wild, but was actually very carefully cultivated to look wild. And part of that wildness was a hermitage often that would be built on the estate so that the landowner could be in the manor house, look out, onto the grounds and see a hermit living on his estate, close to nature, contemplating nature. And then the landowner could vicariously be connected to all of that himself without having to get dirty, without having to give up his social ties and all of the kind of value of being a gentleman and being a landowner, but could still be kind of made more significant, made more whole, I suppose, by having this double to do that work for him.
So there are a few what-ifs working here that I can already detect, detected while I was reading. Number one, what if a connectionless man who doesn't care much or just kind of curious about the consequences of things, what if he loses his do-nothing job? And what if he decides to just see what happens? And what if a modern millionaire took up this Georgian practice of hiring a hermit? What other what-ifs were going on in your head putting this scenario together?
Oh, I think what if is definitely the driving question here. And I think it often is for me. I would say, what if that circumstance, after settling into the new circumstance of being the hermit, that circumstance again changes as his benefactor is taken away from him and he's left on his own? What if his job defines him more than he expected it to? What if it becomes him and his actual self and his work self become so whole together that there's really no separation between them anymore, as I think it becomes later on in the story. And then there are all the smaller what ifs. What if a lion was, unleashed in the garden to befriend him? And what if, various other things along those lines, the little absurdities of Finch's day that his benefactor, Mr. Crane, unleashes on him out of his own whims. I think Mr. Crane is a character driven by the question, what if, as he looks out the window onto his hermit and wonders what will happen if I do this and what will happen if I do that. And as a person with the resources to do pretty much anything, he's able to make those things happen.
Now, do you think that whether someone is employed as a corporate blogger and they're saying, what if I made these fake bloggers lead lives that do where this and this and this happen, or if they're a millionaire and they want to say, well, what if I demolished the houses on this land and made myself an estate for a hermit to live on? And, as yourself, a novelist, asking all these what ifs as well that we just went over. Is it all the same impulse, the same human impulse to ask what if and then to use whatever happens to be around you to figure it out?
I would hope so. And I think whether that's for a novelist or for an artist or for anyone, I think what if is a really powerful question. And I think we could all embrace it perhaps a bit more. And it's the question that leads us to take risks in a personal way. What if I ask this person to marry me? What if I buy this house? Or in the artistic sense of what if I make my story go in a direction that it probably shouldn't go? What if I decide to use a contrivance or a cliche to propel a story forward, even when I can hear the voice of my MFA instructors telling me not to? And so I think that what if is very powerful in professional and artistic and personal ways that we can do an awful lot with.
Now, we mentioned the concept of marketing anyway earlier in this conversation, and I want to bring up something about the marketing of this book, of the Bee-Loud Glade. Now, at least the press insert that I have in my copy has the headline, "In Search of Mindfulness." And that's been a subject that has surprised me, at least in recent literary releases. You know, Lee Rourke's book, The Canal, has been talked about in those terms, about a character who, by working his way through boredom, achieves mindfulness. And there's a certain other novelist no longer with us who has a very talked about book out right now, which is always talked about in terms of mindfulness and boredom. I mean, did you know this was coming up in the Zeitgeist, or did we all arrive on this independently?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think I knew that it was coming up. I may have been noticing it unconsciously, not thinking about it very directly. I think certainly I had finished writing my novel before reading Lee's and seeing a lot of connections there. I would say another, Tom McCarthy's novel Remainder,
Yes.
which I read early in working on this novel, was an influence, and I think made me think about some of the questions that drove the novel forward as I wrote it. I think it may be Zeitgeist, though. I think it's something that is maybe driven by the fact that a lot of the things we've taken for granted as underlying our identities or our possibilities, you know, a strong economy, political stability, you know, military stability, whatever it might be, a kind of national identity or even, you know, international identities, have been undermined to a really great extent. You know, whether it's earthquakes, whether it's health scares and epidemics, whether it's war, terrorism, a collapsed economy. I mean, there's an awful lot that we took for granted as defining who we are as cultures and as individuals that aren't necessarily as solid anymore. And maybe that gives us a space to start questioning some of the other things that we've taken for granted, questioning how important work really is to your identity, or how important it is for you to actually get up and go to that job you don't really want to be going to, how important it is to you to follow the rules, to pay the taxes, to avoid being evicted, whatever it might be. I'm certainly not advocating that everyone quit their job and stop paying their taxes, not necessarily, but I think there's a really powerful possibility that comes out of having doubts raised about the things that had previously been taken as stable. And it can hopefully create some really powerful artistic impulses and explorations that then maybe drive the next cultural moment forward.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm Colin Marshall. My guest is Steve Himmer, editor of the web journal Necessary Fiction and the author of the Bee-Loud Glade. If when the show is over you want to hear the interview again, visit colinmarshallradio.com or visit iTunes and search for the Marketplace of Ideas there. Either way, completely free for the download. Every interview the Marketplace of Ideas has ever aired. Questions, comments, feedback of any kind, Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. That's where you send it. Now, back to the conversation with Steve Himmer on the Marketplace of Ideas. Cultural conversation of the depth you demand. Now, there's certain mythic elements to this story, and there's also many references to elements of the moment, talking about the economy, talking about, you know, ongoing wars. It seems to be set in America. How American is this novel?
I think it probably is pretty American. I mean, that's my context by and large. Certainly influenced by some other works that aren't American necessarily, and thinkers and writers that aren't American. But I think the context is pretty American in a lot of the references, as non-specific as they may be. Maybe in part too, because I mean it's hard to avoid thinking about Thoreau and Walden in this story, and that's such a quintessentially American work and such a defining work of whether we act on it or not, of our kind of national self-image and cultural image of American values and the kind of the wilderness American and all of that. That I think it's hard to get away from that. So there's something very American in that basis, I think.
And when people talk about Thoreau, they talk about, you know, Walden building his cabin out there in the woods. Some people often say, well, okay, it's all well and good for Thoreau, and it's all well and good to enjoy the book, but do know that he still used the products of human society that he needed when he needed them. And there's always that, you know, thinking about Finch becoming this hermit for Crane the millionaire, he lives this what we would consider to be a harshly ascetic life out there in the wilderness, you know, barely clothed. Ultimately, he decides to even do away with that. But with at the beginning this vast support staff of the estate, and then later with a bunch of with a bunch of legal and otherwise conditions set up around him by the departing Mr. Crane. It seems like these guys who live in the wilderness need more in a sense than people who live in regular society.
Yeah, I think finding out that Thoreau was as dependent on as he was on other people, on the fact that I believe Emerson owned the land, that he was able to have his cabin on it all, that he went into town for lunch, that people came to visit him. I think it bothered me at first, having read the book when I was younger and really kind of idealized Thoreau in a lot of ways. And then as I reread it and thought about it and got older, it didn't bother me quite so much, and it seemed inevitable more than troublesome. And the possibility of genuine self-dependence, self-reliance, and solitude and separation seemed less and less likely to me. And I think that a lot of the figures that we idealize in that way are much more connected to culture at large than we might like to think about. I mean, Scott and Helen Nearing and their Good Life book, the book sold copies. The book made them money. The book made them visible in a lot of ways. And I don't think that's a knock at them. I think it's inevitable. And those figures on the outskirts of society perhaps are driving society forward or making society reflect on itself. And the folks that are completely removed, the true hermits, the true solitaries perhaps, are so far beyond the pale that no one even knows they're doing it. So they aren't necessarily a voice that's represented in the larger culture. So telling their story would be a very, very different thing in its own language and probably not understandable to an awful lot of other people.
And, from your own perspective, why, I mean, very basic question, but why try to detach from society?
I don't personally want to do it.
Right.
I do daydream about it quite a bit. And I think when I was younger, daydreamed about it and fantasized about it pretty aggressively, and actually thought it might be a direction I wanted to go to, kind of backpacking forever, which seems a very romantic, 18, 19-year-old notion. And then I did it for a few years and said, oh, that's not really going anywhere. But I think it's the older we get, the more connected we get, the more we advance in a career or advance toward a career, our connections grow tighter and tighter. We're tied to more people. There are more people dependent on us, and we're dependent on more people. We're paying more taxes, different kinds of taxes, mortgages, insurance, all of these things. So we're more and more deeply entrenched and embedded and interwoven with everything. So the question of could we actually separate ourselves from that becomes much more complicated. And I think personally, anyway, I feel a little bit of anxiety about how almost impossible it seems it would be to disconnect. And I think that's further reflected in being online. The fact that I think at this point, if I wanted to erase myself from the web, it would be impossible. I mean, the number of places professionally and personally where I would pop up in just a simple Google search or social network, software, wherever it might be, is all over the place and beyond my own control or even beyond my own awareness. So we're so deeply tied to one another, even people we don't know, and two devices and two cables and whatever it might be, that the question of whether it's possible to stop being that embedded is a really compelling one for me. And I don't know that means I would actually want to do it. But we hear these stories about people who fake their own deaths and drop out and disappear. And it seems like that's the kind of thing that becomes harder and harder to get away with and more unlikely the further we go socially. So I'm really interested in that.
And it would seem that given the disconnection, whatever kind of disconnection Finch achieves when he is on Crane's estate, when he's living in the cave, when he's swimming in the river, I mean, he gets contact with incidental figures, with occasional figures, a fellow who he takes to be a butler, with the wife of Mr. Crane, with some hikers that camp out, but for the most part, it is Finch and his nature surroundings and his own mind. And reading that, I was thinking, wow, geez, that's a challenge for any fiction writer, because there's not a whole lot of human interaction you're going to be able to write about. But then I realized, unless you're Balzac or something, you're gonna be pretty fixed in the territory of a character's mind, no matter what, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that there's the landscape of Finch's mind, and there's the landscape he's in, and at the same time, I mean, he's very much on his own. He's in the garden, in his head, and as readers were in his head most of the time. But it's a landscape and a garden that has been constructed. Mr. Crane has spent a lot of money and time and effort to construct the landscape he wants. So even when Finch is on his own, even when he's kind of left to his own devices to sit on a rock and meditate or float in the river, whatever he might be doing, he's still very much in conversation with the whole process by which that landscape was constructed and by which it's managed, and the wealth through which it's managed. So Mr. Crane is a constant presence in everything he's doing, as are, I think, the support staff of the estate, the workers who built the river, who built the landscape, everyone who Mr. Crane is using to make this whole enactment of inaction, I suppose, into a possibility. So he's never really on his own, even when he's in his own head. And I think hopefully readers get a better sense of that than Finch has, because I think Finch sees himself as very disconnected, as very isolated and self-reliant, at least through much of the story, while it might be apparent to the reader that he's much more dependent on other people than he's admitting to himself and giving those others credit for.
And in the book, you have Crane give Finch tasks, in a sense, that provide him with tools, sometimes give him specific instructions about what he wants him to do, whether it's swim in the river today or do Tai Chi as best you can invent it, standing on a platform. And that seems to me to be, it would be a device I'd be happy to figure out if I were writing the book, because then it would give me a way to challenge Finch, because I could have Crane drop in and assign him something new. How did you think about how to use that particular behavior of Crane's?
Well, for me, Mr. Crane is a character who, I think I spoke earlier about the kind of vicariousness through which the landowner views the hermit, and the hermit is acting out that meditation and solitude on behalf of the landowner who can't necessarily do those things or doesn't want to do those things directly. I think Mr. Crane is a character who would like to be able to do those things more directly. I think as much as Finch is kind of trapped in his identity through work and is bound up in all of that, Mr. Crane, although far more wealthy, far more powerful, he has a much more global reach in the things that he's able to do, is just as bound up and is unable to do the tasks that he's setting for Finch, which is why there's so much whim for him. They're coming from kind of passing whims that he thinks someone should be playing the flute today, someone should be doing Tai Chi, someone should be swimming in a river. They're very fleeting for him, and perhaps as immediate as things he wishes he could spend the day doing, but in fact has to be doing something else. And it allows that projection of Crane onto Finch to happen in a really direct way. That Finch isn't even the master of his own solitude. It's always directed by what somebody else wants that solitude to be.
And there's even beyond the sort of things that Crane assigns Finch, the sort of things he drops off for him to use. You have other cracks appear in the idyll of Finch's life on this estate. I mean, there's the hikers we mentioned that show up. There's certain pieces of information that make themselves evident to Finch that don't necessarily add up to things being completely different than he believes, but certainly suggest that things might be different. Now, reading the book, I didn't treat it as I don't quite know. On the one hand, I was going to say I don't quite know how to lay this out without spoiling the book, but then I realized it's not so much a spoilery type book, because there's not. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not a big reveal book, is it?
No, I don't think so. I think the parallel plot structure, allows this. You can see where a lot of it is going pretty early on. You have a sense of where Finch is going to end up, even if you don't know quite how he's going to get there. So there isn't some great secret that get reveals, at least the way I think about it. So no, go ahead and spoil away.
Well, because I was going to compare it to certain movies like I believe Peter Weir directed The Truman Show, or a movie like M. Night Shyamalan's The Village, movies where characters live in artificially constructed environments. And I realize in saying that I probably spoiled The Village for a lot of people, but not a lot. The Village spoiled itself, I think, so. Yeah, it's that came out in 2004 and not a lot of people saw it, so I think I'm okay. But the movies like that, they do. The Village hinges on a reveal. You don't know the characters are in a nature preserve until the end. The Truman Show, you do realize it all the way through, and that's indeed the premise. That's the draw, is that watch us tell the story of a man who we know everything about him that he doesn't know. And I want to know where, let's think of that as a spectrum. Where does the Bee-Loud Glade fall on that spectrum of person in a constructed environment stories, or is it indeed off of that spectrum?
I would say it's closer to the Truman Show, insofar as I think there's an awareness that it's constructed. There's an awareness of how artificial so much of Finch's world is that's apparent to everyone except Finch. So he's buying into it far more than I expect, than readers do, than Mr. Crane does, than the other folks around him do. I think Finch really wants to believe in that idea of his own self-reliance and solitude and isolation. There's something that feels cheap to me about the way the Village does it, where we're suddenly supposed to turn around and reevaluate the whole story in light of this reveal that frankly was pretty easy to see coming for much of the film. And it's the kind of film where you start by saying, well, that seems the most obvious possible twist. There's no way a filmmaker is going to do that. So you watch wondering what the real twist is going to be. And then it turns out it was that thing that you dismissed at the beginning. And that seems a bit awkward to me. And I wanted to avoid that kind of surprise. Aha, he's a hermit living on an estate. And allow the reader to be grappling with that tension between what actual solitude looks like versus the very networked, very connected solitude that Finch is living in, even if Finch isn't grappling with that so directly himself.
Now, there are, as I mentioned, there are pieces of information Finch gets. There are things he sees. There are shadowy figures moving around, messing with certain boxes and such that he sees on the preserve. There's a certain clipping he receives later on, gives him a piece of information. And as I said before, I didn't read the book and expect or try to get a whole picture revealed to me, the big reveal. But I do wonder, if I were to read the book again right away, would I, if I really cared to do so, be able to piece together everything entirely that's going on behind the scenes in full detail? Because it seems like there is that detail. That detail exists in your mind, but is that constructible entirely from this text?
I don't know entirely, but I think to a large extent, yeah. I think you could piece together what's happening with the folks who are appearing in the garden or in the forest around him, what's going on with Mr. Crane behind the scenes. There's a lot that's happening out of Finch's view, even willfully so. I think he's noticing things and choosing to ignore them at times that add up to something. I don't know that it's a full picture, and I actually kind of had in mind at times, I think more in the revising and the rewriting of the novel than in the original drafting of it, the William Gaddis novel Carpenter's Gothic, right, where so much of the crucial action, so much of the crucial information happens off stage and out of the character's awareness. So as a reader, these things are going on. There's a revolution somewhere. There's something happening in Africa. But we're limited to a very narrow view of the characters' lives and the story as they are. And I really enjoy that kind of reading experience of knowing there's a bigger world, a story that acknowledges that bigger world, but in which the characters aren't necessarily engaged in that larger complexity while the reader is.
Now, you mentioned Gaddis and Carpenter's Gothic, and I can see that now that you bring it up, but, I never would have thought of Gaddis because the voice of Finch, which is the voice that tells the story, is so different than any Gaddis character's voice. I mean, it seems like you're getting far enough into Finch's mind that it could have licensed you to do any Gaddis-type stuff with the text to make it less accessible than it is. But the voice is so accessible, it seems to me that was a deliberate decision, and correct me if I'm wrong, but to make this voice, just something that clicks right in for a reader, that is, if he's not an everyman, it seems like the voice of one.
Yeah, that did become very deliberate. It started, and I think the first chapter took me a long time, and I wrote it and wrote it and rewrote it, trying to find the voice. And the original versions of it, the first attempts I made, had a much more fragmented voice, much more directly reflected what the language of a person who has stopped speaking a long time ago and doesn't have anyone to kind of communicate with and doesn't even hear a lot of speech might sound like or read like. And I think I played with that in a much more literal way, and then backed away from it because I wanted that everyman quality. I wanted that kind of more relatable sense of Finch. But the early version of that voice was much more exaggerated, much more jumping from idea to idea. Kind of similar in some ways. I actually had looked at this as a bit of a model in terms of voice, not in ideas, but Ted Kaczynski's Manifesto, which is just an astounding and terrifying document, and the way that you can see a mind working with a logic that is alien to pretty much everybody else, and assembling language and syntax around that kind of misshapen logic. Was something I was really interested in. So I think the novel started going in a much more of a manifesto direction, and I wasn't really happy with that, and I didn't really feel like I wanted to go that way, so pulled away from it pretty consciously.
And you mentioned Ted Kaczynski. That's a name that comes to a lot of people's mind when they think of those who isolate themselves from society, those who withdraw, those who try not to contact anybody or be contacted by anybody. Of course, Kaczynski has a hostility. I mean, very much. That's an understatement. Yeah. But Finch doesn't seem to care one way or the other about society. He doesn't have a problem with industrial technology or what have you. None of this Kaczynski stuff. He just kind of doesn't care about the rest of the world, does he?
No, I think Finch is pretty disinterested. And for a guy who's really, really passive, I think he's also quite selfish or self-absorbed, to the point where he doesn't even realize the amount of labor, both physical labor in terms of building his landscape, but also daily labor of the support staff, of the folks who are working around him to make his very, ideal and lifestyle possible at all. He's pretty blind to a lot of that. So certainly not politically conscious in any way, not with the anger of Kaczynski or even with with the way that Thoreau was concerned with larger questions of society and culture and humanity. I don't think Finch particularly cares about any of that so much as he's absorbed in doing the things he's doing every day and trying to perpetuate that lifestyle he's come to enjoy as well as he can.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm Colin Marshall, and my guest is Steve Himmer, author of the new novel The Bee-Loud Glade, and the editor of the web journal Necessary Fiction. If you'd like updates on the Marketplace of Ideas as current and upcoming interviews delivered straight to your email inbox every week, sign up for the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. You can find the details all very simple at colinmarshallradio.com. They're there on the front Marketplace of Ideas page. And then every week you will get updates on all things MOI. Now back to the conversation with Steve Himmer on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. Now, we mentioned before that on his job as a blogger, Finch created a set of characters that became, I don't know if you want to say his friends, but became the people that surrounded him, the people he invented. He'd always think about their stories. Later on, losing his job, he would think about how their stories might have continued had he continued blogging. And then, living as a hermit on Crane's Preserve, he starts referring to the river as the old man. He starts referring to the scribe in the back of his head who records things for him. He builds a cast of characters around him. He kind of semi-anthropomorphizes a lion, names him Jerome. What is this an impulse that is distinctive to Finch, or do you see in that something universal that anybody would do in these isolated situations to build a cast?
I don't know about anybody, but I do think, for Finch at least, it's a matter of, as much as he idealizes solitude and disconnection, he needs connection and he needs society. And as I said earlier, I'm skeptical of the possibility of real separation from society, and I don't think it works for Finch, whether it's, turning the lion Jerome into more of a friend than a lion might actually be, whether it's inventing the bloggers who kind of populate his life at the same time his actual coworkers have come to ignore him and forget he's there at all. And also with the old man and with, which is a presence or a character in the story that can be maybe read in a number of ways, from the spiritual to the more practical. But I think I tend to think of it as Finch's need for a boss and a need for someone giving him orders or giving structure to his time and establishing him in a relationship. Because to have a boss, to have a supervisor, above you immediately establishes your relationship to everything else around you and puts you in a very firm place. And that seems to be something that Finch needs. Whether I don't know that I would go so far as to say that all of us need that or that most people need that, but certainly for Finch, and it's certainly something that I wonder about. If part of the appeal of work and of having a job and a career and that identity is that it establishes who we are in relation to the world around us, as well as who we aren't in relation to everyone else.
You mentioned before Finch's blindness to the things around him, the signals around him that might be giving him a bigger picture of his situation on this estate, but that's a metaphorical blindness. There's also the literal blindness of his sight failing him, perhaps other senses failing him. I mean, in a certain sense, I thought, this guy's got it hard enough, but he also near the beginning of his narration of his time in, I should say near the earliest of the book's narration of his time on the estate, you have him talk about his failing sight. Now, that keeps him from finding out or acknowledging more about a situation. But what else does it do for the story?
I think it raises or it creates another level of artificiality, perhaps, because he becomes dependent on visual memory of what the landscape around him looks like, of what his garden looks like, of where things are physically, which leads him into problems very early in the story when he thinks he knows where he is, or he thinks he knows, what objects are around him, and he turns out to be wrong. So it creates a whole other level in which the whole space of his garden is being constructed, and in which his experience is being constructed in response to that. So in a way, there is no there. There's no real physical layer of the garden, because it's always through memory or filtered through technology or filtered through something. Whereas if he was living without that looming blindness, that increasing blindness, he would be able to respond in a very direct way to the immediate landscape around him without so much mediation. And I didn't want him to get to that point in his story or in his life. I wanted constant mediation between Finch and his environs.
Now, thinking about the premise of the Bee-Loud Glade, thinking about the sort of the what ifs we discussed at the top of the hour or close to it, I think of the idea, and I don't really like the idea of literary genres. I do find them to be more of a marketing exercise than anything, but I think of the genre name of speculative fiction, which has more recently we've seen the science fiction community use it as a bit of a public relations label, although they've always had public relations issues. But this seems to me to be a novel that is not in terms of label, but literally a speculative work of fiction. And as soon as I say that, I think, well, aren't they all kind of isn't every novel? But what about, this is literally a speculative exercise, right? I mean, even though I'm kind of tripping over my words, you know what I mean, right?
Yes, I do. And I agree with you. I think that the term speculative fiction is as problematic as a term like literary fiction, because it suggests that something is excluded from that. And every piece of fiction is speculative because you're inventing something that hasn't actually happened. You're speculating on what might happen. And every piece is literary in the sense that you're responding through literature. But it is very, for me, very much about that speculation, about that what if that we talked about, imagining possibilities that aren't necessarily easily available to us. And I think it's a question that really drives my interest in writing at all, and it drives a lot of my reading in fiction, is trying to think about ways the world might operate even at the individual level that it doesn't usually or doesn't presently, or that I haven't actually experienced. So imagining other possibilities. And I think for me that makes storytelling a really powerful tool. And while I hope the novel doesn't become kind of didactic in this way, I'm really, invested in environmentalism and in thinking about kind of an eco-critical approach to literature and to culture. But one of my concerns about that work and that kind of activism has to do with the dismissal of storytelling and the dismissal of fiction as a tool for improvement or a tool for accomplishing anything. There's an emphasis on nonfiction, on essay, on science writing, on poetry even, whereas fiction kind of gets pushed to the side. I think storytelling is a really powerful tool because of this speculation, because it allows us to ask how things might be otherwise and to actually dream in a very tangible way of what we might make the world look like or what we might not want it to look like, that allows us to kind of move away from much more immediate, literal, current events, I suppose, of what's actually happening. It allows us to think in a broader, more speculative way that is really crucial in everything for me.
Now, so we can know more about how this book is speculative, I kept wanting to read the next chapter and the next chapter and the next because of the way that it's speculative, because I want to know, well, if this happens, then what are the consequences? What would this be like if this man stopped going to work, stopped paying his bills? Oh, what if he lived on this preserve? How would he do that? There's a very kind of basic human impulse to always want to know more with that kind of speculation. And it's the kind of impulse that makes me occasionally pick up the books that normally get called speculative fiction these days, as I said, science fiction books. But when I read those, I usually don't read very far into them because it's they lose their connection to the world as I can speculate about it very, very quickly because of the fantastical nature of their settings. How do you keep the speculation, for lack of a better word, interesting in this book? Because it stays that way in the way that quote-unquote speculative fiction, in my experience and in the experience of a lot of readers I know, doesn't.
I don't know that I would want to offer a kind of prescriptive answer to that. I know for myself as a reader, what I tend to respond to in if we're going to say speculative fiction or even science fiction, is a story that happens on a human scale. So something if it's space opera, it feels too far removed from a human scale for me, from a kind of individual scale or the familiar. Whereas a writer like Philip K. Dick or a writer like Cory Doctorow sometimes, I can respond. Even William Gibson in some of his novels are writing at a much more relatable individual human experience level that I can respond to. So the questions of how technology changes our lives, changes identities, changes our experience of the world is happening through genuine, believable, or at least relatable human experience, rather than happening at levels of enormous spacecraft and interplanetary travel, which for me is hard to get invested in because it seems too unlikely and too far removed from what I'm actually thinking about on a day-to-day level. So it's for me, it's that balance between the familiar and the relatable and the speculative, and not going too far in either direction.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's an element, at least that I saw, of the mythic here, of a very old type of story of a very, that there was once a man who was selected by a rich man to live in a world he built. There's that element to it that makes it seem not how to put it, but it seems like if you want to talk about the story, you can talk about it in grand terms. You can apply archetypal terms to it. You can talk about humanity if you like, but it's also a book of minute details in some senses, of the actual feel of scraping your knee on a coil at the bottom of a riverbed, to use a very specific example. Did you think about it as a balancing act between those two halves, the one half that of the mythic and the grand, perhaps, and the other half of the foot and knee injuries that Finch endures?
I don't know that I thought about the mythic so much as I was very, very conscious of making the story as embodied as possible, as physical and tangible as possible, because it's a story that runs the risk. It's so much in one character's head, and it's a character who doesn't speak. There's the risk of getting too far into his head, becoming so ethereal that it's not grounded in anything. And I really wanted to keep him grounded. So through injuries, through that constant embodiment in some awkward, some embarrassing, sometimes uncomfortable ways, it kept it grounded for me and kept it from kind of floating off into the ether. But I wasn't really thinking about myth so much as thinking about a quiet or kind of contemplative presence, and the way that contemplation and meditation and these things are happening in an embodied way, at least for Finch, that it's always both. He's always both a kind of contemplative presence and an embodied presence at the same time, and doesn't really seem to separate the two.
Would it at all be correct of me to say that Finch invents a kind of Buddhism along the way?
Yeah, I mean, it's he is not knowledgeable about Buddhism. He's not. I'm not trying to suggest that he is. Certainly, he's kind of making up a lot of things. He's arriving at maybe a very organic or a very individual, maybe Buddhism with a small b. Certainly not accurate in any kind of spiritual sense or traditional sense, but maybe arriving at some of the qualities that are valuable in that worldview on his own. And in a very kind of progressive, or in the sense of making progress toward it, way.
I've been speaking with Steve Himmer, author of The Bee-Loud Glade, a novel new from Atticus Books. Steve, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
If you'd like to learn more about The Bee-Loud Glade and Steve Himmer, visit Steve Himmer, STEVEHIMMER.com. This has been The Marketplace of Ideas, and I've been Colin Marshall. Our theme music is, as always, produced by Ben Althouse. Find him at benalthouse.com. Questions, comments, feedback of any kind, send that to Colin, COLIN, at colinmarshallradio.com. And if you want to hear any old episodes of the show or this one again, visit colinmarshallradio.com or the iTunes store, where you can search for The Marketplace of Ideas on iTunes or colinmarshallradio.com. The complete archive is, of course, completely free. Weekly updates on all things The Marketplace of Ideas can be had by you in your email inbox if you sign up for the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. Details on the front Marketplace of Ideas page at colinmarshallradio.com as well. As always, thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time on the Marketplace of Ideas for more cultural conversation of the depth you demand.